This sermon is a copy of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on the 13th of November. We'd love you to join us in person if you currently just access this content online. But for now, before listening to the sermon, if you could please read Matthew chapter 24, and the verses are below the video. Without realizing it, the films and stories we watch have all trained us to watch out for certain signs. The signs of ominous footsteps, the signs of a creaky door, the signs of suspenseful music, are all a sure sign that something about to jump out at us and go, boo. We've been trained to tune into these signs so that, when we see them, we can prepare ourselves and get ready for the jump scare that's sure to happen next. We see the signs and switch on. And yet, if we're made to wait a long time and nothing happens, we switch off. If we wander through the dark, dark town, and then are taken down the dark, dark street, and we encounter a dark, dark house, and in the house there's some dark, dark stairs, and after walking down the dark, dark stairs, we enter a dark, dark cellar, and at the end of this dark, dark cellar there's a dark, dark cupboard, and we open the dark, dark cupboard, and there's a trapdoor leading down a dark, dark set of stairs, and down at the bottom of those dark, dark stairs there's a dark, dark room, and at the opposite side of the dark, dark room there's a dark, dark door. And when we open the dark, dark door, there's a... By this time, you probably switched off. Because after a long time of hearing the signs, nothing seems to happen. Throughout the centuries, Christians have usually fit into one of these two categories. The categories of very switched on or totally switched off. Jesus said, "I'll be back when he returned to heaven." And some people are either switched on or switched off as they anticipate Jesus' return. Some are very switched on. They might always be on the lookout for signs that match the prophecies of Revelation. Or they might see major world events as signs that Jesus is about to return immediately or very soon. Whereas others might be described as switched off. After 2,000 years of waiting, Jesus has not returned. And so they scratch their heads, wondering if maybe they or Jesus was mistaken. Or they might simply give up waiting, perhaps wondering if this Jesus stuff has all been wrongly hyped. Chances are you probably fit into one of these two categories if you're a Christian. Or maybe you flit between the two. Chances are you're either very switched on or totally switched off. You might see certain things that cause you to be very switched on, awaiting Jesus' return. Or you might think certain things that cause you to be very switched off, not expecting Jesus to return at all. Or you might simply live in such a way that Jesus' return has no practical effect on how you live day to day. It's for reasons like these that the words of Jesus in chapter 24 are highly relevant to us all. For in these chapters, Jesus spoke both to those who were very switched on and to those who were very near to switching off. Firstly, Jesus spoke to his disciples. And when Jesus spoke about the destruction of the Jewish temple to his disciples, something that Jesus predicted during his lifetime and then happened after his lifetime in 70 AD, when Jesus spoke about the destruction of the Jewish temple, his disciples suddenly became very switched on. For they misguidingly believed that the destruction of the temple was a sure sign that Jesus was about to return. and so they wanted to know times. When will this happen? And signs. What signs will happen so that we can prepare for your return? Verse 3, the disciples came to Jesus privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Give us a time so that we can be ready. Give us a sign to watch out for, so that when we see the sign, we can prepare. In what follows, Jesus gives neither. In regards to times, the time of Jesus' return, Jesus said, about the day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. About the signs, Jesus said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. These are all things that people so often see as signs that Jesus is coming, or signs that the end of the world is soon. But Jesus said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. In other words, don't look to these as signs that I am just around the corner. Then again in verse 7, Jesus said, nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Again, these are all signs that people look for, signs that people sometimes think mean that Jesus is coming soon, or the end of the world is nigh. But Jesus says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. In other words, these are not an end sign, a sign that the end is just around the corner. These are more of a reminder that the end is always approaching, but no one knows how long it is going to be. And yet, despite promising no signs, some people will still be so switched on, so on the lookout for signs, that they'll claim to have some unique insight and know the approximate time when Jesus will return. They'll have cracked some biblical code, or they've matched some newspaper headline to the prophecies of Revelation, and so they alone know the time and date, or at least know that Jesus' return is very near. And yet Jesus said, so if anyone tells you, there he is, or there I am, out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or if anyone says, here he is, in the inner rooms, do not believe it. In other words, if anyone says to you, Jesus, he's just around the corner, you might miss out if you don't listen to what I say. Jesus says, don't listen to them. If you are the switched on type, you need to pay attention to what Jesus said. Jesus has not given us a time so that we can get ready before the day arrives. Jesus has not given us standout signs to watch out for so that when we see the signs, we can prepare. Yes, there might be signs in the sense of a ever-increasing severity of certain things. But Jesus hasn't given us any definitive standout sign that he is just around the corner. Jesus hasn't given us standout signs to watch out for so that when we see the sign, we can prepare. Instead, Jesus wants us to be always ready, because he said he could come at any time. Jesus doesn't want us to be so switched on in the sense that we become this type of person. I'll wait, and when I see the sign, then I'll get ready. And then Jesus arrives. Jesus wants us to be people who are already ready, people who are always prepared, people who are always living as if the end is nigh, even on the ordinary days when it seems like the end is not very soon. In other words, the order isn't wait, see sign, then get ready. Instead, we're to be ready no matter how many supposed signs we do or don't see. Jesus' message to be switched. Jesus' message to the switched off among us is the same. Verse 37, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. In the days of Noah, people were getting on with ordinary life, eating, drinking, marrying, getting engaged. These things aren't sinful to do. Jesus' point is that these are normal, everyday activities of normal, ununique days. And it is this type of day that Jesus will return on. There will be no trumpets, no fanfare, no sign in the sky saying, "Don't bother buying long life milk at Aldi this week. You're not going to see the end of it." Instead, the day that Jesus returns will be like the day of Noah, a day when people expected nothing out of the ordinary to happen. As Jesus said, in the days of Noah, they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The people in Noah's day were to be ready for a flood because Noah had said a flood was on its way. They were not to wait for a sign, such as storm clouds, before they got ready. They were to get ready because of Noah's word. Likewise, Jesus has said that he will return. Therefore, we're not to seek signs before we get ready, nor are we to switch off from being ready because there are no signs that Jesus is on his way. Instead, we're to be prepared now because there won't be any time to prepare later on. Well, hold on a moment, you might say. No time to prepare? We've had 2,000 years to prepare, and Jesus has still not appeared. We've been sat on our deck chairs looking into the sky, and yet the fizz in our arrival toast, it's gone flat. So much for Jesus coming soon. Well, if you're thinking this, you're absolutely right. Jesus has not yet returned. And so it might seem that the church is waiting for Jesus. Well, it's been a bit pointless. But it's important we understand what Jesus meant by the word soon. I am coming soon. And it's also important we understand what Jesus meant by being ready. Firstly, what did Jesus mean when he said, "Behold, I am coming soon"? The word soon in the original language is tachy, a word that I use very often at work. I work as a nurse. Tachycardia means fast heart rate. Tachypnea means quick breathing. You might also have heard of a lorry driver and their tachograph, something that records the speed that they're driving at, as well as other things. Tachycardia, well, a normal heart rate is boom boom, boom boom, boom boom. One beat, a pause, the next beat, boom boom. A fast tachy heart rate, however, is boom 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 boom. No pause, no chance to prepare for the next beat, because the next beat suddenly follows. A normal breathing rate is and in, and out, and in, and out. Whereas a fast, tachy breathing rate is you breathe out and suddenly the next breath is there. It is this tachy meaning of the word soon that fits with what Jesus said about his second coming. For example, in verses 15 to 21, Jesus compares the event of his second coming to the events of 70 AD, when the Jewish temple was destroyed. When the Romans invaded Jerusalem, there was no time for God's people to get ready. As he says in verse 17, "Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak." The events of 70 AD didn't happen like this. There was some sign that the Romans were coming. God's people got ready, and then the Romans arrived. Instead, it was more like this. Boom! The Romans arrived, and there was no time after that moment to get ready by grabbing your coat. It happened suddenly, quickly, in a moment. In the same way, there will, generally speaking, be no standout signs before Jesus comes. There will be a gradual increase in certain things, but there won't be any standout signs that give us time to prepare. Instead, boom, Jesus will arrive, tacky, quickly, fast. If you aren't already ready, it will happen so quickly, it will be too late. As Jesus said in verse 30, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Jesus basically says the sign that the Son of Man is arriving. Son of Man is another name for Jesus. The sign that the Son of Man arriving will be the Son of Man arriving. For a split second you might be able to sense that he's coming, but tacky, quickly, suddenly, he'll be there. You'll have no chance to prepare after he appears. Now that's a lot of information to take on board, so maybe do a little wiggle on your chair to wake yourself up. That's a lot of information, but what is the application? If Jesus isn't encouraging us to be overly switched on, nor is he wanting us to be totally switched off, what practical response is Jesus encouraging? And just to remember, Jesus is talking to disciples, not those who aren't believers. So the applications to this passage have to be more than simply put your faith in Jesus before he returns. What is that practical response to this passage for Christians? Well, one potential application is this: live each day as if Jesus could return today. It's the Christian version of live each day as if it's your last. There is room for this application, but you might encounter a few obstacles in trying to put this into practice in your life. For example, most days we aren't given the choice between the sensational and the comfortable. I speak for myself, but I guess most days you aren't phoned up and asked, "We desperately need someone to whitewater rapid down the Amazon River and evangelize an indigenous tribe that like to discuss philosophical issues whilst hanging upside down from bungee ropes. Are you up for it?" Now, if you're the type of person who regularly gets these type of phone calls, please go ahead. Live each day as if it's your last. Choose standout, sensational opportunities to serve Jesus. But generally speaking, for most people, living faithfully for Jesus is slightly less sensational and slightly more mundane. What does it mean to live as if Jesus could return today while stacking shelves in Aldi? What does it mean to live as if Jesus could return today when you are tired and every week is more or less a repeat of the last? What does it mean to live as if Jesus could return today when investing in mission and outreach that is less than glamorous? What does it mean to live as if Jesus could return today when making simple choices which no one will notice or care if you act with integrity or not? Most days the choices we are faced with aren't whitewater rapids versus the sofa type choices. Instead, the choices we make are less sensational choices. Choices between obedience or disobedience, faithfulness or giving up, integrity or compromise, perseverance or packing in. Whenever Jesus talks about his return, he urges us towards these types of decisions. To keep going when we find ourselves flagging, to choose obedience even if there seems to be no reward, to make sacrifices when not making them would seem to be more convenient. Basically, Jesus is telling us to do what he's already called us to do. And why? Because one day he'll return. And on that day, we'll be glad that we did these things. This seems to be what Jesus is getting at in his ending parable, where a master gives a servant a job to do and then goes away on a journey. The servant thinks, my master's not back, he's been a very long time, and so he starts not doing what his master told him to do. Basically, the master didn't ask his servant to put up fluorescent lights ready for when he returned. The master didn't ask his servant to teach his other servants how to do triple axel backflips. The master called the servant to simply obey. He called him to long-term faithfulness, straightforward getting on with the largely mundane work that he left him to do. And this getting on with the mundane, being faithful, simply obeying God, it's a lot harder to do than it is to learn how to do triple axel backflips. Straightforward obedience, long-term faithfulness are actually quite hard. For example, Jesus calls us to be his witnesses. This is hard when 99% of our efforts don't produce any visible fruit. Jesus called us to prayer. This is hard when there's so many more appealing things to do. God calls us to integrity and hard work in the workplace. This is hard because you can get paid the same for being lazy and for cutting corners. God calls us to live knowing that one day every material possession will lose its value. And yet this is hard because these things have value in the here and now. Jesus calls us to keep going for one simple reason. One day he will return. And this is hard because so many Christians are faced with several big reasons why they should give up on Jesus in the here and now. Perhaps they're violently attacked or marginalized or mistreated or imprisoned. The temptations in all of these circumstances is to switch off. Forget about how Jesus will return and change everything. Forget about being faithful long term. That's why we need to constantly remember that one day he will return. And on that day, everything will change. On that day, we'll see things differently. On that day, the 1% fruit from our labours will be eternally worth it. On that day, we'll see the face of the God who actually saw us acting with integrity in the smallest of situations. On that day, the sacrifices we make for Jesus will seem small compared to the great reward that we're rewarded with in eternity. So don't switch off when following Jesus is less than sensational, and there are no signs of his return on the horizon. Keep going, even when following Jesus is a bit mundane. But what about if you're the switched-on type, always watching out for signs that Jesus is returning? Isn't that a good thing? Well, sometimes people can be so busy figuring out when Jesus is returning that they forget to factor it in to how they live. They get so obsessed with signs and times that they forget to get on with serving and telling. We're called to tell people about Jesus, not estimate the time of his arrival. We're called to serve other people more than we're called to serve our intellectual curiosities about debatable matters. Now, these things aren't irrelevant. They are very relevant as long as we apply them to our lives. In addition, being switched on might result in us having a short burst of enthusiasm during the times when we believe that Jesus might return. For example, during pandemics, or when some major event shocks the world, or when someone appears who could be the Antichrist. We might have a short burst of enthusiasm during these times, because we believe the end is nigh. But then we lose our enthusiasm on the more ordinary days when we're called to do the mundane. Perhaps it's reasons like these why Jesus ends talking about the end times with this simple focus on being faithful servants. Jesus is calling each of us to be committed to whatever God has called us to do, to committedly serve Him, obey Him, and to sacrifice for Him every single day